First of all, welcome, and this is Gerard Murphy's granddaughter, as I mentioned earlier. Judymay has been with us. She's been with us today, and she was with us yesterday. And she sent me this morning. You sent me a very nice poem by Ulick O'Connor, which he wrote in honour of Gerard Murphy, as well as most extraordinarily interesting document, his application for a lectureship in UCD, and the testimonials that went with that, both in Irish and in English. And Judymay, you said earlier that you have many things to talk about, so you don't have time to talk about those, but I might briefly just show the audience what we're talking about before you express your memories of your grandfather. So to begin with, here is the poem by Ulick O'Connor for Gerard Murphy, a beautiful poem. My ear Englished I might never have found beneath the halting cadence and hoarse ring of our Irish verse, that sunken music, if one day you had not brought before the mind a line of O'Rahilly's, and as you teased the words out, caressing their assonances, like a lover repeating endearments, I wanted somehow to find the key to unlock what imprisoned me. And I think many of us gathered here today and yesterday will feel, in some ways, will share these sentiments and will have experienced Murphy's work in a similar way. And here is the application to UCD for position of lecturer in 1932. And as you can see, all the documentation has been gathered together, or was gathered together by UCD. And it begins like this. It's maybe a little bit small there on the screen, but just to give you a sense, I hereby apply for the lectureship in modern Irish language and literature advertised in the Dublin morning papers of February 20th. I append copies of testimonials received from the following persons: Professor Osborne Bergen, PhD, D. Lit, or I best Esquire, D. Lit, Librarian of the National Library; Professor Owen MacNeil, D. Lit; Professor Douglas Hyde, D. Lit; Professor Tháigo Dhonnchadha, D. Lit; Dr. Rudolf Thurneisen, Professor of Comparative Philology, Bonn. What a series of testimonials to have. I don't think any of us could ever aspire to, having had such letters from such giants in the field. To the testimonials, I append an account of my university studies and degrees, practical experience and published work. Professor T.F. O'Rahilly, M.A. D.Lit in Celtic, Research Professor of Gaelic Languages, University College Cork, has authorised me to state that he strongly approves of my candidature. I don't think there would have been any doubt in any case, and that he has the highest opinion of my capacity and attainments, and that he is of the opinion that I am admirably fitted for the post, the Provost of TCD, under whom I am at present working on the Royal Irish Academy's catalogue of Irish manuscripts, has let me know that he will be glad to act as referee and answer any inquiry that may be addressed to him about my work. Gerard Murphy, Ballymun Road, Dublin, 15th of March, the Ides of March indeed, 1932. And that just shows you what application forms looked like back then. They wanted you to maybe spend your time learning things rather than spend your time filling out insanely long application forms. Yeah. So the testimonials then continue, and I won't read them out, we'll be here till the crack of doom, but this is Osborne Bergen's letter. I have much pleasure in supporting Mr. Gerard Murphy's application, and he, or I best, it gives me much pleasure to testify to the high qualifications of Mr. Gerard Murphy, M.A. for the post of lecturer in modern Irish language and literature. And he finishes his letter: I regard Mr. Murphy as in the foremost rank of Irish scholars, and therefore an ideal occupant of the post he is now seeking. And Owen MacNeil, Mr. Gerard Murphy has within a few years established a high reputation for fine scholarship in Irish linguistic and literary studies. Douglas Hyde, I have much pleasure in paying a tribute to the scholarship of Mr. Gerard Murphy. Garrod O'Murchu, he has completed a difficult work of the highest interest at once to scholars, poets and folklorists in editing the hitherto inedited poems in the Dhuinire theme with translation notes and other necessary apparatus. And then this marvellous one, I didn't have time to make it a little bit smaller so you could see it better, but Taig ó Dhonnchadha Olaf le Gaeling Coláiste Ollscoile Corpig, Shínathe, look at the Shanachlo there, and he says, Is clostum go bhfuil machara garod ó Marachu M.A. ag éileh postulé hoireachta san Ghaeling sa Ghaeling san Choláiste Ollscoile Mla Clia. Bevallum é bholle man duine rúnach don fostsan tá sa gom gur duine é a chur an sin sa Ghaeilge agus a lauren I gachain uair is féidir leis é go bhfuil tuiscinte de le tríocht agus go sonríoch don ilíocht idir árán agus dúineacht. And it's lovely to have that testimonial in Irish and in the Shanachlo and the Shanna Litru and Shínathe Taig ó Dhonnchadha, and he doesn't mention Torna at all. And then Turneisen, and he writes in German, Herrn Gerard Murphy, sagen alle seine Arbeiten als einen Feinsinnigen und Verständnis wollen Kenner und Beurteiler der irischen Literaturwerke, and he signs it the professor of the an der Universität Bonn. So all of these testimonials must have been a marvel for Murphy himself, I'm sure, but also for whoever was going to be interviewing him. And these are his qualifications, as you see, UCD, School of Irish Learning, Dublin, 1923. Interesting, that's the name of our own school here now. And there was a lot of fuss at the time when we were being schoolified as to what to call ourselves, and it looks like we were in good company. Gaeltacht and Coláiste na Mún, teaching and literary experience, published work, and then in the press, Dúinear a Fín, part 2, part 3, his published works, Scoti Peregrini, and other published work. So that leaves me, I suppose, to hand over to Judymay, and I will just perhaps do that now and return to the slides in a minute when we begin the readings. So Judymay, over to you.
Lovely. Well, he got the job. We all know this. I'm going to bring you forward a little bit to 1941. And hopefully you can see me.
Yes, just maybe if you moved a tiny little bit over to, if you move over a little bit.
So in 1941, he was a married man. He married Mary O'Neill, who became Mary Murphy, who then became eventually the Dean of Women's Studies in UCD. And he had 2 children. 8 or 9 years old was Anne Barbara, who we call Anne B, my aunt. And then a babe in arms at the time, Danny O, now called Dr. Dan Murphy, my father. And they, in order to escape the bombings at the North Wall in Dublin, where they were, so in order to escape those, he was commissioned by the Third Floor Commission to go down to Carey and to interview the older people speaking Irish. And he did this by having these wax drums, and he would interview them. And my aunt would often run on up ahead. And this is probably the most outrageous name drop I've ever done. So one time, he was interviewing Peg Sayers. And he was down the hill, and my aunt ran up the hill. And Peg said to my aunt, "Sure, how's he going to make it up that hill? He's an old man." Now, at this stage, he was 40 years old. So why was it that she thought he was an old man? This is actually central to his life. And Grandad Gerard, as we all fondly call him, although none of us met him, none of the grandchildren, there are 10 of us, none of us met him. My cousin Andrea was born a few months after he passed away. We all knew that part of the story was his health. That in 1926-27, he was diagnosed with TB, and he went over to Switzerland and he had his left lung removed. And after that, he didn't have a lot of energy. My dad said that he never saw his father run, for example. Although my aunt says that she never saw him as a frail man, but she just thought it was normal for someone to stay in pretty much all the time and read and study. He was a very, very scholarly man. And also, I think, for me, the most important thing is that absolutely everybody I've spoken to has talked about what a lovely man he was, like how he was so supportive. I think someone once criticised him as not knowing the geese from the swans, talking about how he would praise everybody, particularly his students. Like he didn't mind what level you were at. He was going to be there. He was going to be your cheerleader. A wonderful, wonderful man who all the time had to change dressings, wasn't very high on energy. It wasn't actually his lungs that caused him to pass in the end. It was some sort of stomach cancer that we don't exactly know what it was. And so, you know, very young for these days especially, he did pass away. So let's go back to when he was younger, when he was a schoolboy in Mount Dhonnchadha. I do have notes. I've been interviewing my aunt and my father with the help of my cousin Andrea for the last few weeks, and so a few little details we'll slip through. So we went to Mount St Benedict in Wexford. It's a beautiful house. You can actually see the building on Google if you Google that. And in fact, what I'm going to be doing, because we're not going to be able to cover more than a few lovely stories today, I'm going to be putting together a document which I will send to Emma and Callan, and I'm sure they'll find a way to share it with anyone that would like to see, particularly where it pertains to things like the great relationship that the Murphys had for generations with the Dillon family. Also, my grandfather's love of Glenstone Abbey when my father ended up going to school. But even before Dad went to school there, Grandad Gerard was one of the governors of Glenstone, and he was a very, very religious man. He was a young man of faith, a very good man, and he. As my aunt said, she never heard him criticise the church, and I'm sure in his brain he was always thinking about and criticising a lot of different things. So what I'd like to do today is really just give you a few stories that will give you some pictures of what it would have been like. Although I'm very aware that really for the last 2 days now we've been living in his world. This was his world, all of the different worlds that the wonderful speakers have been conjuring over the last 2 days. That was such a huge, huge part of who he was. And so I'd like to put in place the part, for example, that they all lived in 4 Palmerston Park in Dublin 6. And he, as well as being completely immersed in Old Irish, he also studied lots of other things. He studied obviously Greek, he studied the Bible in Greek. There's a lovely piece of family lore where he would go over to, he was over one time in Palmerston Park and he was practicing his Welsh. He was learning Welsh, he was practicing all the Welsh sounds. And a woman came across him doing this and literally ran and hid. So, he was very, very committed to that. But also, I remember as a child, in our house, we grew up on Mairín Road, and there were these wonderful bookcases that were full of his books. And I didn't realise that they were his books until very much later. But it shows what he was reading, and it was my introduction to Thackeray, Shakespeare, even Christopher Fry, all kinds of classics. And so he wasn't just about one thing; he was all about everything, as most great scholars are. A really lovely story that my aunt told me was how she loved to go for walks with her dad down Dunleary Pier. And it really it ties in with talking about the Finn cycle this morning, because he would tell her things like how he thought, his ideas for the Finn cycle, what he was thinking in that moment as he was working on it. What were his thoughts, and how did he think that it tied in with Greek mythology? And she says that he spoke in a very slow, deliberate, thoughtful kind of way. And I did know his youngest sister, so his younger sibling, his only sister, was our Aunt Maureen. And when we were growing up in Dublin, at least once a month on a Sunday, we would have dinner with her. And from her, she was an incredible woman in her own right that did amazing things. I can get that feel for that kind of like slow, deliberate, scholarly, thoughtful way of being. Anytime I've asked people about my grandmother, I knew my grandmother until I was about 4 or 5 when she passed away. And they all use the same word, they all lead with the same word, and that is the word formidable. And you really can't talk about Gerard Murphy without talking about Mary Murphy. And she was that. I remember it. My cousin told me recently that a wit at the time described her as a gift to the deaf, which I thought was quite clever. You know, just very dogmatic, very loud, very deliberate. You wouldn't want to cross it, let me put it that way. And perhaps there are people here today who knew Máire and Gerard, and please, we'd love to hear your stories about them to add to ours. So yeah, I was interested this morning when Dr. Parsons was talking about how Gerard made space for the female voice, and I laughed out loud because I think in his life he didn't really have any other option. So my dad reminded me this morning that these very simple human things are really how we get to know someone. And Granddad Gerard is such a fan of bird watching. So when he was growing up, he loved bird watching, and then he used to bring my dad across to Palmerston Park and also in the back garden, and would explain all the birds. He's fascinated by birds, which of course ties into a lot of the poetry about birds, the images about birds that we know from his work. So when you ask someone what was your dad like usually it's kind of a hard question to answer because you grew up in that. So how can you judge something when you don't really know anything else? But both my aunt and my dad were absolutely unanimous in this and emphatic in it, that he was just a lovely, lovely dad, a lovely man. That Christmases were lovely. They'd go out to Aunt Maureen's house and spend Christmas there. And again, I'm reading out so many details about his other fascinating siblings like Baldwin and Lonan and Dermot. And definitely I will be putting together a document for anyone who's interested in reading about those. So just a couple of things, images that I thought were really lovely are that he had these things called slips. So anytime he had an idea about what would be a good translation or what would be a link between two certain things that he wanted to say, he would just put them on these little scraps of paper called slips, and then he would file them away really well. And anyone who would visit his office would see these slips, these ideas, this way that he would take what was inside him, these ideas that were flowing inside him, and just capture them for use later. I thought that was beautiful, and apparently those were left after he passed. Those were given to the UCD library, so that might be a fun job for somebody to ferret those out and see what those are. At one point he went to lecture in the Sorbonne. That was in 1951, and he brought my then completely out of her depth to her own telling aunt. So she was 18 years old, went to the Sorbonne, and she was really overwhelmed by all these dinners and all these incredible people. But a thing that I love about that is that to this day he's still in Paris in part, in that there's a copy of early Irish lyrics at the Irish Cultural Centre that my sister Susie, who lives in Paris, visits often, in the 5th arrondissement, and it's just lovely to know that he's still honoured in Paris. And as well as I'm really realising, I think, from this wonderful symposium, just all the different places in the world where he's known and honoured, and as a family we really, really want to thank everybody for keeping his legacy alive, and hopefully we'll be able to connect with you a little bit more and be a little bit more useful to you in that endeavour. He was also really into having people around the house. As my aunt pointed out, my dad pointed out, back then we didn't have the money to gather in the pub, so we really pretty much had to come around the house. And on Saturday afternoons, he would have his philosophical group, and they would gather, and they would just have such love of philosophy that without any particular intention of publication or argument necessarily, they would just share what it was that they were reading and thinking. And then also he would have a lot of his students around as well. But when someone would knock on the door, my dad would answer the door and he would say, he's up doing philosophy. So this is just the way this was completely normal to them, just what happened in houses. And when the students would come and gather, like people would just be sitting around on the floor. Ulrich O'Connor, who wrote that lovely poem, thank you so much. I'm so sorry for doing the homework on the bus and just sending you all that very last minute. But apparently my grandmother did not really approve of Hugh the O'Connor, and he was known for things like he got kicked out of a debating society in the UCD, and then tried to get back in by dressing up as a woman, and Queen Mary did not approve, and she wasn't a woman that you would want to court or disapprove of. So yeah, just not to take up too much of your time today, I just wanted to finish on, and as I say, there's loads more stories and lots of detail, but I am going to put that together for you as a document that is part of this celebration, and I just wanted to get you to just, well, for all of us to just feel who he was. And so just to finish, a really lovely story that my dad told me that I think really sums things up. My dad was school friends, he was a schoolboy, he was friends with George Sisk of the famous Sisk construction empire. And at the time, George Sisk's dad had been responsible for the newly built Galway Cathedral. So George Sisk said to my dad, "My father built a cathedral." So my dad went home and said to his dad, "You never built a cathedral." To which Gerard replied, "His father never fixed a pronoun." Absolutely delightful. And I think that all of us who have been gathered to celebrate him, we would argue the idea that he didn't build a cathedral, because in so many ways, in the social, the personal, the creative, and the academic, he did indeed build a wonderful cathedral, and it's marvellous to be gathered there for these 2 days. Thank you.